And so I'm here to introduce our speaker tonight. I'm Marcia Watson. I'm president of the Patuxent Bird Club, and this is a joint meeting of Patuxent Bird Club and Prince George's Audubon. Our speaker is Karan Odom, who is a behavioral ecologist interested in how animals evolved their often complex behaviors. She is especially interested in the evolution of elaborate bird songs in female as well as male songbirds. Karan combines phylogenetic comparative methods with field studies in order to tease apart the evolutionary processes responsible for the biogeographical patterns we see in female and male songs today. Karan is a research associate at the University of Maryland, College Park, and recently completed postdoctoral training at the esteemed Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Karan received her PhD at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, studying male and female song in troupials, a tropical oriole in Puerto Rico, and her master's degree was at the University of Windsor in Ontario, studying the function and geographic variation in barred owl duets. Karan also runs a citizen science project, the Female Birdsong Project, encouraging wildlife enthusiasts to help document the understudied singing behavior of female songbirds. So before I turn it over to Karan to share her screen, I just wanted to remind folks to please mute your microphones for this portion of the meeting. And it would be helpful if you would also turn your cameras off in order to save bandwidth. So with that, I'm turning it over to Karan. Please take it away, Karan.
Thank you very much, Marcia, and thank you all for having me. I'm really excited to be this month's presenter because I think it's very appropriate given the subject matter, and that I'll be talking about bird songs, that I'm presenting just as we're starting to hear all of these lovely bird songs in our area. And so I'm going to first go ahead and share screen. So give me a second to do that.
Don't forget the sound button.
Thank you. I just clicked that. Okay, so hopefully this works. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see my screen. Let me know if you can't. And so again, thank you for having me. And yeah, I'm just really excited to be here to tell you not just about bird songs, but specifically about female bird songs. And so I think this is an excellent time of year. Females sing sometimes at the beginning of the season, but sometimes closer to egg laying, or sometimes more toward the end of the breeding season when rearing young. So keep your ears peeled throughout the breeding season for singing females. Okay, there we go. And so without further ado, to provide a little bit of context for why I study birdsong and female bird songs, birdsong is one example of a suite of kinds of traits called elaborate traits that animals exhibit. And throughout the animal kingdom, animals exhibit a really astounding, sometimes beautiful, sometimes really beautiful sounding variety of elaborate traits. And these range from everything from colors to sounds to displays to armaments, things like antlers and whatnot that animals use to compete with rivals. And we often think of these traits as sexually selected, and we often think of them being particularly elaborate in males because we think that they help males compete with rivals for access to females or to attract females. However, we see, if we take a closer look throughout the animal kingdom, we actually see that there are a lot of species where females are also elaborate. And so females of many different kinds of species can be elaborate too. But when we think of females and female elaborate traits, things get a little bit complicated. And actually, the thing I want to point out is all of these examples, all these beautiful photos you see here, are of females of their species. And so that is just to point out that females can be equally elaborate as males. They can be just as fancy, and they can also possess kind of the same range of elaborate traits, everything from antlers to colors and sounds. But like I said, when we think about females, things get a little bit complicated. And this is for a few different reasons. One is that when we study and look at why females use elaborate traits, we see that often females do not use elaborate traits to attract mates. They do sometimes use them to compete with other females for mates, but by and large, females seem to use elaborate traits for broader purposes, such as general competition for territories or food resources. Sometimes it's food resources for themselves, sometimes it's food resources for their offspring. And generally females are not using these behaviors just to attract mates, and they can also use these behaviors outside of the breeding season. Because of that, we think that these elaborate traits in females don't seem to be exclusively sexually selected. They're not used just to gain some kind of mating advantage. In addition to that, we see some really interesting patterns where females have evolved these traits in a large number of taxa, and then just some individuals are missing these traits. So in that case, it seems like females, a lot of different females evolved this behavior, and then the behavior's been lost. And so to us, that indicates that there are a variety of selection pressures, and that these selection pressures might not just be sexual selection that are acting on these female elaborate traits. And then lastly, something that I've become more interested in recently is that when we think about how the female traits are regulated, females are often performing these behaviors with much lower levels of testosterone than males. And if females are using these behaviors outside of the breeding season, they also have much lower levels of testosterone. And so it seems that females may be using these elaborate traits, and these traits may be regulated in ways that are slightly different than how these traits are regulated, or basically how they're controlled within males. So, and so all combined, this kind of calls into question how we typically think of these broad sexual dimorphisms as evolving. And so it means that there's still a lot of interesting open-ended questions about why we see big sex differences in some species where males and females look really different, and then both males and females having really elaborate traits in other species. And so it leaves open the question, how did this variation evolve, and what are these animals using these elaborate traits for? And in addition to that, I think an important part of addressing this question is, in understanding the evolution, is also the mechanism of how these traits are regulated within individuals as well. And so these are questions that I strive to answer through my research program. And I answer these by studying the songs of male and female songbirds. And so songbirds are an excellent system to address these questions in, because we know a lot about birdsong. There's been a lot of excellent research on birdsong and birdsong function. However, a lot of this research has been done on temperate male songbirds. And in temperate male songbirds, we see a very distinct pattern where males, like this male song sparrow, sing really fancy, nice, beautiful songs. And they sing a lot early in the breeding season, just like this. And they sing to attract females and repel rival males. And comparatively, in temperate regions, females often sing less, or in some species, not at all. And so by that kind of paradigm, these male bird songs really seem to fit the classic definition of a sexually selected trait really rather well. However, if you go to the tropics, we see a very different pattern. And again, things get kind of complicated, because both males and females can be really elaborate. They can look really elaborate with both males and females, like these Puerto Rican, or they're actually Venezuelan troupials, but these troupials that I studied in Puerto Rico, where they're introduced. These troupials can have really elaborate, colorful plumage, And in troupials, both males and females sing. And this is true for a lot of tropical species, that both males and females sing. And both males and females, I'm going to argue, sing really complex songs. And you can tell that just by looking at these song spectrograms here, which is showing the notes in the different types of note structures that are in these two bird songs. And you can see that there are a lot of notes and a lot of different types of notes and a lot of variation in the note structure. And so I'll play each of these songs for you. And so just sit back and enjoy them, but hopefully you'll appreciate that these are both pretty complicated songs. Oops. And so that was the male song, and here is the female song. And so both males and females can sing, both males and females can sing fairly complex songs. And yet even in their most recent book, their most recent edition of the book on birdsong, Clive Catchpole and Peter Slater defined birdsong as a long, complex vocalization produced by males in the breeding season. And yet, songbird biodiversity, just like biodiversity in general, as shown by this heat map. So this is a heat map generally of biodiversity. It's fairly easy to see that majority of biodiversity exists in the tropics, and the same is true for songbird biodiversity. And as I just told you, this is where male and female song is common. In the tropics, a lot of species, both males and females sing. And so this caused my collaborators and I to wonder, is it possible that female song is a lot more common than we previously thought? And could female song even be the norm rather than the exception, which means that it's quite possible that this whole behavior has evolved in a different way and has additional functions and different uses in different taxa than we've thought about previously, or than we typically think of as a typical bird song. And if that's the case, then we really need to be including females in studies of birdsong and birdsong evolution in order that we can get the full picture of how this really complex, interesting behavior has evolved. And so in order to do this, I will tackle several questions today that I am looking at in my own research in an attempt to better understand both the prevalence and the evolution of this behavior in female songbirds. And so I will try to address these 4 questions. I'll talk about how prevalent is female birdsong throughout songbirds. What are some of the evolutionary drivers of female birdsong? How is variation in female birdsong regulated? So I'll be shifting gears a little bit there to talk about mechanisms and work that I'm currently doing. And then I'll finish up by talking about the need for and how citizen scientists can participate in better documenting female birdsong. And so the first study that I'll tell you about was a project that I conducted during my PhD research right nearby at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And for this project, we would answer 2 fairly straightforward questions. We wanted to address just how common is female birdsong, and then we wanted to look at when did female song seem to have evolved. And this might seem like a pretty complicated question, but we felt like there were 2 alternatives. One alternative is that female song evolved fairly early on, and that it evolved maybe both in males and females, and that the ancestor of all songbirds had it. And so it's something that evolved early on a long time ago, or it's possible that female song evolved only in just a few species and more recently in those species, and we would consider that a derived feature that only a few species or a few females have. And so those were the 2 alternatives that we were examining. And so to do this, we used a variety of different species accounts and books on the natural history and life history of birds, including this Handbooks of the Birds of the World, which at the time was the sort of the premier compilation of all the information that we had on every single bird species that exists. And so this is a really large series of books. Each one is a tome, and a really huge book with lots of information on every bird species. And so we read about all of the species that we wanted to include in our study. This was around 1,000 species that we scored female song for. We scored female song as either present, that there was evidence that females sing, or absent when there was a lot of information about male bird song, but there was no information about female bird song. And we were able to score female song for 44 different songbird families. And so what did we find? And so I won't spend too much time on this because this is a bit of a complicated figure, but this is a phylogenetic tree. And around the outside of the tree, I have labeled whether female song is present or absent for all of the current day species on the tree that we were able to find information for. And as you can see around the edges of the tree, there is a lot of red. And so that means for all of these species that we were looking at, we found a lot of examples where female song was present. And in fact, in total, we found that 71% of the species that we examined had female song. We then did something called ancestral state reconstruction. And so then what we did is we took information about presence, absence of female song in all of these species around the edge of the tree. And then we used computer models and algorithms in order to calculate the likelihood. We basically went back in time and took into account how all of these species were related and how long they had been evolving. And we figured out a single number, a likelihood that the ancestor of all songbirds had female song. And in the end, we ended up with a 92% likelihood. This was a really high likelihood that females sang in this ancestor of all songbirds. And so what does this mean? So first off, we found that female song is a lot more common than we previously thought. But in addition to that, female song is fairly widespread. So it's found in a lot of different songbird families and exists throughout the songbird family tree. And then what I thought was really interesting is that we provide evidence that female song evolved early in songbirds. So if you can imagine what the ancestral songbird looked or sounded like in this case, you could imagine that both males and females were singing. So in the ancestor, both males and females had song. And then since then, a lot of things have happened. There's been a lot of evolutionary time that's passed. And in some species, females have continued to sing and continue to have female song, but in other species, females have lost song. And this is a really different evolutionary scenario. So the original evolutionary hypothesis was that males have fairly exclusively gained elaborate female song, and then there's just some species where females have it or have also gained it. But in reality, what's happened is both males and females gained it, both men and females had it, still a lot of females have it, and then some females have lost this behavior. So it's been selected against. And so that is now how we think that female and male birdsong evolved. And so what are the evolutionary drivers that have selected for female song in the first place, and why have some species lost it? To address this, we went back to our books. We went back to these really large tomes with all kinds of information about bird biology. And we increased our survey. We now scored song for closer to 1,700 songbird species. We actually looked for information about all 5,000 songbird species, but we only had really concrete, solid information on male or female song for 1,700 species, or where we could actually say whether or not females sing in those species. And then in addition to that, we wanted to know how much are females singing. And so we scored female song as either being similar in amount to male song. So females sing similar amounts of female song as males. Females sing somewhat less than males, females sing a lot less than males, or females don't sing at all. And so these were the 4 different ways that we scored female song. And I could not have done this work by myself. This work, because we looked at information for so many species, involved a small army of undergraduates from Cornell University who helped me dig through all of these species accounts. So once we had this female song information, we wanted to know what are the evolutionary drivers. And so we had then several different variables, several predictor variables that we thought might explain why females sing or why females don't sing. And so these variables represent different hypotheses for female bird song. And so we measured those as well. And then we compared our data sets. So we compared how often females were singing, and then in those species, whether they had or did not have these different traits. And so here I'm going to show you another phylogenetic tree. So here is just a glimpse at our results. And the main thing, so there's a lot going on here. The main thing I want you to take away is that there's a lot of variation. So yellow is species without female song, and then the different gradations of oranges and pinks and purples are species with female song. And you can see that there's a lot of variation. And we found fairly low phylogenetic signal. And so what that means is that this is a fairly variable or labile trait. So it's a trait or behavior that turns on and off really rapidly evolutionarily. And this makes sense with us seeing this trait in some species and then not seeing this behavior in close relatives. So it's a trait that's really variable and can be turned on and off evolutionarily pretty easily. We also see that there are some lineages or taxa where female song is still fairly common nowadays, such as in New World blackbirds, or especially the neotropical wrens. We see a lot of species that duet and have female song. And then there are other taxa where female song seems to have been lost in many of the individuals within those groups. And this includes things like the New World sparrows and the estrilded finches. And if you know anything about birdsong research in the lab, the zebrafinch is the model species, the poster child for birdsong studies in the lab and understanding the mechanisms that regulate song and how song is learned. And so it turns out we are studying this in a species that just happens to not have female song from a lineage where female song is not very common. So you could imagine if we had other model species or a model species maybe from the tropics, we might see that we would actually be studying bird song and birdsong learning in maybe a species where both males and females sing. And so for the evolutionary drivers, we found several different evolutionary drivers that seem to predict whether or not females sing, and that help us also understand in what scenarios have females lost song. And so the major predictors that we find are that most species that sing are sedentary. Most species where females sing are sedentary. And so this is a well-supported result that's been shown by other studies, that female song is most common and females are singing the most in species that are year-round territorial. Whereas if you have movements toward migration, so species that become migratory, then you have species that females no longer sing, or females sing a lot less in these migratory species. And so that could be one reason that females have lost song, is this move to a more seasonal migratory type behavior. We also found that female song is common in species with paternal care. And in fact, I think of this variable as sort of a necessary precursor for species to have female song, that if a species loses paternal care or paternal care does not exist, it is highly unlikely that females sing. So most females don't sing or won't sing if males are not also providing care. And then lastly, this is just sort of more an interesting variable that we found, this relationship with body size, where females that sing the most are species that are particularly large-bodied. And the interesting thing about this is that a recent study looking at the world's distribution of species where males and females have elaborate plumage or not, in species where females are equally elaborate as males and have the most elaborate plumage, females in those species are also large-bodied. So we maybe see this interesting correlation between species that are selected to be heavily ornamented in their plumage and species who are heavily ornamented in their songs, having both elaborate female song and plumage, being larger-bodied. And so in conclusion for this part of the talk, we found that there were a variety of different hypotheses that we supported. Some of these were previously recognized. Some of these are new observations. And in addition, I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but we also did something called a phylogenetic path analysis, which allowed us to look at relationships among all of these variables and how these variables might be interrelated. And by doing this analysis, we were able to recover some interesting patterns that people have noted for the last few decades, including large biogeographic patterns where things like breeding latitude influence migratory behavior and year-round territoriality. And so kind of tying together the fact that female song seems to be associated with tropical breeding and these other behaviors. And in addition, we were able to find a relationship between mating system and paternal care, which to us supports longstanding ideas about how mating system evolution influences other suites of behavior and in turn, these sexually dimorphic traits. And so, so now shifting gears quite a bit, I want to tell you about some new research that I've been working on at University of Maryland College Park, and work that I'm looking into to discover how female birdsong is regulated and how these mechanisms might be different than in males. And so in male songbirds, a lot of research has been done, again, often on temperate male songbirds, but in temperate male songbirds, we see this fairly distinct pattern, and there's this well-supported classical paradigm that as photoperiod or day length increases, we see increases in testosterone in the spring, early in the breeding season, and those increases in testosterone seem to correspond to increases in male singing. Oops. However, in females, we do have a little bit of evidence in one species that the increases in day length correspond to increases in song rate, but we don't have information on this in hardly any other species, and we don't have information on whether the molecule or the hormone that's involved is testosterone. We don't know if testosterone is increasing in these species with as day length increases, and we don't know if testosterone is the molecule that is influencing or causing increases in song rate in females. And so we wanted to investigate this. So to investigate this, we performed two different experiments. One, we wanted to look at if seasonal increases in testosterone correspond with seasonal peaks or increases in female singing. And then second, we performed an experiment called the challenge hypothesis. And this is a well-supported hypothesis in males that has been tested in a lot of species and not just birds. I think there's evidence in lizards and fish and all sorts of other animals as well for the challenge hypothesis. And the idea is that if these behaviors are testosterone mediated, if you perform a territorial intrusion, so you think in an animal, if you make an animal think that another animal is trying to take over its territory, then it should have a spike in testosterone corresponding to that perceived territorial threat or intrusion. And so we performed an experiment where we played females back female songs to make them think other females were intruding on their territory, and then measured their testosterone shortly after. And so I want to introduce the star of this part of the presentation. I did all of this work in house wrens, and house wrens are an excellent study species for this question because they are very abundant and they're nest box breeding species. So it's really easy to set up nest boxes and have them show up in areas fairly near human habitation. And so they're a great species to work with. For our purposes, they're also excellent because both males and females sing, and I'll play these songs for you in just a second, but males and females also play sexually distinct songs. So males sing a different type of song than the females sing, and when you get used to listening for these songs, you can actually hear them in the field, and you can hear the difference between a male singing and a female singing. And so I'll play these songs for you. And so I'll first play the male song. And so the male song is just going to be the typical house wren song that you're used to listening to, really bubbly, chattery, with a lot of variable up and down notes. And so I'll play this twice. Here's the first time on the male song. And here it is again. And in comparison, the female song is a lot buzzier and is more continuously up and down. And so this is what the female sounds like. And here's the female again. Although I'll add something really interesting that we are finding in females is that the female song can be really variable and can vary from many more notes and a lot more up and down structure to this to a lot more chattery and buzzy and sort of short and harsh. So the female song is fairly variable. Whoops. There she goes again. She just had to sing one more time. And so an additional perk of this system is that we can use AI, and so we can use the help of trained algorithms in order to help us detect these male and female songs. And so for our study, what we do is we have these small audio recorders. We have them so that they record the first few hours of every morning. We put them under or near the nest box. And then all the songs that the males and the females sing at their nest box in the morning are recorded. And then we can use the computer algorithm to go through and locate every male song and every female song that happens in that morning. And so this is a pretty nice system for being able to gather data on song rate. And this is something that an undergraduate researcher at University of Maryland has been helping me with. So Maxine Sue is an undergraduate researcher who's been helping run these algorithms and train these algorithms. And she is a dual computer science and biology major. So she's quite talented and has been a huge help to this project. And so to get back to our research questions, we are the first question, we wanted to correlate changes in circulating testosterone levels with changes in female singing behavior. And so research by my colleague, Kara Krieg, she has shown previously that females have this peak in singing early in the egg laying period. And so if you want to hear a female house wren sing, that's the best time to hear it. Actually, once egg laying starts, if we walk on almost any of the female territories, we'll hear the female house wren singing around her nest box. And so this is the time of year when the females are singing most. And actually, you can see that they're relatively silent at other times, especially later in the breeding season. And so what we did is we went to our house wren boxes, we set up mist nets, and we caught each individual at 4 different time points: early breeding, egg laying, incubation, and nestling feeding. We simply took a blood sample, we put bands on the birds, and then we let them go. But we took the blood sample, and then we can observe that individual later and measure their songs and all sorts of other things about their behavior. And then back in the lab with the blood sample, we siphon off the plasma, and in the plasma we can measure the amount of circulating testosterone with these hormone assays. And so what did we find? Well, we find support for previously supported hypotheses that male song and male testosterone is relatively high at the beginning of the breeding season. So male testosterone is quite high, and 2 to 3 times higher than it is in the remainder of the breeding season at early breeding when males are singing most. But we do not find this pattern supported in females. We don't see a spike in female testosterone at early breeding. We don't see a spike in female testosterone during egg laying when females are singing the most. And in fact, female testosterone concentrations do not vary at any time during the breeding season, although oddly maybe a little bit at nestling feeding, but not for majority of individuals. However, a main thing that I want to draw your attention to is that female testosterone really is relatively or really very low in female house wrens. And so there's a stark difference between these 2 axes, the y-axes for both of these plots. And so females have about 1/5 the amount of testosterone that males have at any point during the breeding season. And so we then conducted our challenge hypothesis, where we looked at if female testosterone can increase, and if female testosterone increases in response to territorial interactions or in aggressive situations. And so we played female house wren songs on house wren territories. We did see a behavioral response. Almost every female responds strongly to this behavioral challenge. Females often are singing in response to the playback. They're diving at the playback speaker, and then some of them become so agitated they do this wing waving display, just trying to get that other female to leave her territory. And so then after we give them this playback, the playback lasts for a few minutes, and then we 15 minutes later put up a mist net, catch them, and quickly take a blood sample. And so after we have completed this experiment, we then go back to the lab, measure testosterone concentration, and as you can see in this plot, we did not find support for the challenge hypothesis. We did not see any significant difference between the amount of testosterone or the testosterone concentration in the birds that received the playback. So we had some individuals that received the playback, and then we had control individuals that received no playback. And there's no difference in the level of testosterone in these females that received the territorial intrusion. And so in conclusion, for this part of the study, we found that female circulating testosterone overall is very low. Female testosterone does not increase during seasonal peaks or seasonal increases in female singing. And lastly, we did not find support for the challenge hypothesis. So female testosterone does not even appear to increase in response to a territorial challenge or intrusion. And so for us, this seems to indicate that female house wren song, as well as maybe even territorial behavior, does not seem to be regulated by circulating levels of testosterone. And so if it's not testosterone, what is it? And so we're just starting to enter into this phase of the study where we're trying to think about and look at alternatives. And three possible alternatives are that possibly it is other steroid hormones. So maybe it's other hormones, especially hormones that are tied to reproduction, that are responsible for causing these increases in female singing behavior. Two really strong candidates are progesterone and estradiol, which increase during egg laying when females are singing a lot. And so this is actually the next thing that we plan to look at. Another possibility is that it actually could be some kind of change in activity in the brain. One of the most likely possibilities is that there are increased numbers of receptors, or basically the parts of the cell surface that the steroid molecules bind to. There could be increased numbers of receptors in songbird brains, and especially females at this egg laying stage. There could be increased numbers of receptors or receptor density. And that could allow females to be more sensitive to testosterone. So that's another alternative. And the last alternative, which is actually the one that we're most excited about and that we have plans in our organizing right now to look at, is that it could be just other genes in general. There could be other kinds of pathways, maybe not even necessarily steroid mediated, that are responsible for these changes in female behavior. So this is the direction that we plan to go next, is to look at gene expression and in which genes seem to be turned on or off during the time of the season when females are singing most. And so that's a little bit about my future directions, what I'm working on now, and then where we plan to go next. But I want to end the talk by emphasizing that we still really don't know a lot. There's so much that we don't know about female bird song, and that we still really have a great need for female bird songs and knowledge about female bird song. And so I've spent this whole presentation telling you how much we know about female bird song, and that female song is common. Our current estimate, based on looking at how much information we have on female bird song across all songbird species, is that about 60% of songbird species have female song. However, we only have information on whether or not females sing for about 25% of songbird species. And so this might be a little bit confusing, but what it means is that if you pick up our book about all birds and are looking for information on female song or just on sex-specific song, you find a lot of species where there's just not information on whether the bird that's singing is a male or a female. And so some species it does specify that singing bird is a male or a female, but most species it does not. And so we're just lacking information on whether the individual that sings is a male or a female. And so why is this the case? And so it turns out that 75% of birds are species often where males and females look the same. So it turns out actually majority of bird species are monochromatic. So males and females look the same in a lot of species, and especially in the tropics. And so if you go to the tropics, you see a lot of species where males and females look the same. Males and females are both ornamented or brightly colored. And so these species, it can be really hard to know, and we just don't have the information yet on whether or not females sing. However, in addition to that, even in temperate areas where we know a lot more about a lot of the birds that are around us, there's a lot of dichromatism where you can tell the difference between males and females. Still, in two of the largest sound collections, the two largest collections of bird sounds, we see that less than 1% of all recordings in those collections are labeled as female. We see a lot larger portion of recordings in those collections that are labeled as male, but we actually still have the same issue where, by and large, majority of the recordings are not labeled with either sex. And on the one hand, this is probably good because it probably means people are being conservative and not guessing on whether a song is by a male or a female. Although we do see sometimes a little bit of bias where the recordist didn't necessarily see the bird, but does label it as male song. So I think there's some past bias that exists a little bit in these collections. But we also see a lot of times where there just might not be any notes at all. And so one of the big parts of this research and us looking into how much information do we know about female song comes with a plea to that if you're recording bird songs, try to get your eyes on the bird. And if you see if it's a male or a female, it's really great to have this information in these recording collections. And so I want to point out that this sex bias is not just necessarily in recording collections, that even in collections of physical museum specimens, and especially bird skins, as well as actually mammal skins as well, we see that there is often overrepresentation or greater representation of males. And this is often in really fancy looking birds, so really elaborately plumaged birds, but it can also exist in birds that are relatively dull, where there's still a sex bias, with the bias often being toward male. And so in an effort to fix this, at least for sound collections, my colleagues and I started a project called the Female Birdsong Project. And this is a citizen science project, and it is aimed at encouraging researchers, also encouraging people like yourselves who are the people on the ground out there looking at birds on a regular basis, encouraging you all to, when you see female song or just when you're out and about, to be looking for instances of female song and documenting that. And so there's several ways to document that. You can document that most easily through eBird. You can document it in your checklist if you only see the behavior, but you don't get a recording or a video or a photo of the bird. Then you can just simply make a comment in your checklist about along with that species, indicating that you saw this behavior by this bird. And that's really valuable information for us to know when and in which species females are, when females are singing and which species it is. And then if you're so lucky as to get a recording, or if you want to go out and try to actively record females, then it's really great to have you upload these recordings into collections like Macaulay Library or Xenocanto. And so if you're interested in this, you want to learn more, we have all kinds of information about this and how to observe females and which species have female song and which species we still don't know about female song. There's all kinds of information about that on our website. And you can also follow us on Facebook or listen for our female song tweets on Twitter. And in addition, these articles are a couple or few years old now, but we also have a few articles in various magazines and different sort of public forums as well. And so altogether, the goal here is that we're interested to better understand birdsong evolution and but we are missing a lot of information about females, and we can get that information on a species by species basis as researchers by looking at female song in individual species, like these troupials that I studied for my PhD. But it is a lot more time effective to have the cooperation and help of folks like yourselves who are on the ground and observing birds all the time and who might see these behaviors. And so together, collaboratively, we can document these behaviors and study and understand the world's biodiversity of bird songs. And so with that, there are a large number of people that I need to thank and who have been involved in this research, including many exceptional undergraduates that I've had the opportunity to work with, and lots of funding agencies. And I want to thank all of you for listening today and for being here for my presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kara. It's a fascinating presentation. We'll let you stop the share, and I'm going to stop the recording.